You mentioned something in the pod. Why does the US feel so comfortable this time with a small percentage of its military budget for Ukraine to basically use US weapons to go strike Russia and straight up like take territory, do things that were, getting as close as you can to full out war, basically, to direct involvement at levels that would have been kind of unthinkable in the Soviet times and like in the Soviet Union US Cold War, like any kind of direct confrontation was seen as something that could lead to like, World War III. And that's how people are kind of often talking about the Russia Ukraine stuff is like it could catalyze World War III. And everyone's always saying, right? I always hear from like Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer, even, right? They would always say that, "Oh, well, this is going to lead to World War III. Why are they doing this? This is irrational." But you made this great point, which is if it's so irrational, why do they keep doing it? Clearly, there must be something that, the call it the deep state, whatever State Department of the United States knows that we don't know. I kind of want you to elaborate on that a little bit because I feel like that is something I just did not hear from people who have observed this conflict.
So when it comes to something like Ukraine, it would have been unthinkable, as you said, in the Cold War to be doing anything like this. If you think about 1956 in Hungary, when the Soviets went in, there was really no serious consideration of any kind of NATO troops or NATO weapons going to the rebels in Hungary to try to enable them to defend themselves against the Soviet army. Anyone who talked about that would have been considered a total nutcase. Now, not only does that happen in Kiev, which is much further east, but they have been willing to move Ukrainian troops into the territory of the Russian Federation. They have been willing to strike targets inside the territory of the Russian Federation. Why are they doing that? I think the Russian military and intelligence services are heavily exposed to the World Wide Web and to the American intelligence services through their use of the World Wide Web. I couldn't tell you specifically, technically, how they go about it, but that to me seems like the only compelling way of explaining, unless the Kremlin is just physically bugged, enormously bugged in ways we can't imagine. They must think they have very good information on the day-to-day conversation within the Kremlin, such that they can know Kremlin intentions to such a degree that they can conduct these kinds of operations. Otherwise, we would expect them to have stopped, or for people who are inside the State Department, inside the military, to be disobeying orders or leaking this out and going, oh my God, we're doing things that are incredibly risky. Do you guys know about this? There would be a ton of whistleblowers coming out about it and going, this is really risky. We're not seeing that.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, I'm here with who has become a regular guest on the show, Benjamin Studebaker, Ben Studes, the GOAT. You already know who he is if you've been listening to One Dime Radio for a minute. You've been one of my favorite people to talk to on this platform and off this platform too. And I think a lot of my audience feels the same way. I mean, whenever we have a discussion, you know, it just people just love it. They listen to the whole thing. And yeah, one thing that we need when we have Studebaker on the show is, which you're really good at giving us, is a reality check, a cold shower. And in Canada, we have we have been feeling a certain type of way about these Trump tariffs. And I've simultaneously never seen more unified Canadian nationalism, Canadian pride than I've ever seen in a long time. And also so much cope. And you have a no cope mentality. It's one of my favorite things. You come from a very nonpartisan angle a lot of the time. And yeah, I feel like there's some insights you could give us on this whole situation because it is very bizarre. I mean, like, first off, the first question I'll start with, because you don't really need to introduce yourself. Pete, you're taught at Cambridge. We already know. We already know. You have two great books. We covered them both on this show. But the first question, okay, is what is Trump's strategy with these tariffs? Because it's obviously bad for Canada to be hit with these tariffs. But I mean, what does America really have to gain? It seems kind of bizarre that the US is pissing off, frankly, its closest allies, its biggest supporters, its most loyal allies. And, people are wondering what's the point of this? Are they trying to like move people closer to China? I mean, what is Trump trying to get out of this with this strategy? And is there any way Canada can actually protect itself? Because I think Canadians, we've convinced ourselves we can. Everyone's immediately trying to, every politician, left, right, and center, they're all trying to say we're going to stand up to the bully Donald Trump and, you know, we're going to win the tariff war. But I'm curious what your insights on all of this are.
So I think it's really about the pivot to Asia, right? Remember Barack Obama's pivot to Asia from like 2009? There's been this long-term strategy, and the Democrats and Republicans are both committed to it, but they have some differences in terms of how fast to do it and how to go about doing it, of moving the attention of the American military apparatus from Europe to Asia. Now, to do this, the United States could abandon Europe, but that isn't really what anybody wants to do. The focus is instead on getting the Europeans and the Atlantic allies more generally to contribute more to the maintenance of security in Europe so that the United States can pivot to Asia without giving up anything in Europe and without having to increase defense spending as a percentage of total US GDP. Defense spending as a percentage of US GDP is at one of the lowest levels it's been at since World War II. It's incredibly, incredibly low. This is something that people don't talk about very much. It's around 3%, 3.5%. It was up around 5 in the first Obama administration, just under 5. And that's where Bush pushed it up to. It was down at around 3 at the end of the Clinton administration. And then, of course, during the Cold War, it was much, much higher. It was, in the range of 7, 8, 9, depending on when you look, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. The 70s were a low decade. The 60s were incredibly high, around 10. Then the 80s are the second bump up. A lot of the time we act as if the military industrial complex or defense is a constant factor, but it's not. It's a variable. The amount that we spend on defense goes up and down. The thing that's been amazing from the point of view of the United States is that it's been able to retain its level of centrality in terms of security while spending at a level that is quite low by historical standards. So the goal of the United States is to keep spending very, very little while at the same time militarizing the Pacific. And to do this, it needs the European allies to step up and pay more. But to get the European allies to do this, it either needs to offer inducements or sticks, because the Europeans have been able to spend much less for quite a while. They've been permitted to spend less. And in part, this goes back to the need to economically redevelop Europe after the war. It comes back to the need to have strong European economies, to integrate the post-Cold War states into the Western Bloc and make these states rich, turn them into Polands, make them into attractive states so that other states in Eastern Europe go, wow, this looks like a lucrative bloc. I want to join this bloc. There's got to be less attention and less energy and effort and capital poured into that. as the emphasis will instead be on developing the states that are near China, that it can be potential allied states, states like Vietnam, Philippines, India. These states have been neglected. They've been traditionally overlooked by Western capital. They now have an opportunity to get a ton of money very quickly and to do very, very well if they play their cards right. However, to get the Europeans to pay more, either there has to be some kind of deal cut with the Europeans that gives them a positive carrot, and the Obama administration considered a free trade agreement with the European Union for that purpose. Or alternatively, the Europeans have to be intimidated and pushed into doing it. And they can be intimidated and pushed into doing it through a few different strategies and tactics, right? One would be a tariff. Another would be to start a conflict with Russia and Ukraine. Another would be to destroy the pipeline that carries oil from Russia to Europe and then compel the Europeans to become more dependent on American energy and frustrate efforts to build other pipelines, say through Turkey, that might give Europe other sources of oil and gas. All of these things have been kind of going on, though the degree to which the United States is deliberately doing these things and the degree to which they've been happy accidents driven by autonomous decisions taken by the state of Ukraine is continuously negotiated. And questions are raised about, does Ukraine act alone when it blows up pipelines? Does it act with the permission of the United States? Does the United States turn a blind eye? How involved is the United States? Did the United States know that the Russians were planning to invade Ukraine? Well, they claim that they knew. Why didn't they do something to stop that from happening if they knew that it was likely to happen? Did they think that there might be a benefit in Russia invading Ukraine such that they refused to talk to the Russians about this issue? Why did they think that would be to their advantage? Right? There's all kinds of questions we can ask about that. Now, if you want to intimidate the Europeans, one way that you can really intimidate them is go after the Canadians and the Danes, because the Canadians and the Danes are in a weaker position, and there's less that they can do vis-a-vis the United States than the European Union can. And by showing that you're big and tough with the Canadians and with the Danes, you can try to create a situation where when you start trying to do this with the Europeans are concerned about how you might go about it, and they're taking you seriously because of the way you've been behaving. So part of the trouble is that it's not as if the United States has that much to gain by starting a spat with Canada. But in starting a spat with Canada, a state that trades an enormous amount with the United States and is therefore remarkably easy to bully, especially given how much oil and gas production has increased in the United States, at this point, the United States exports more oil and gas than it imports in total, which means petrol states have much less leverage over the United States than they had 10 or 15 years ago. And that includes Canada. So Canada is an extremely difficult position. And by taking this hard line with Canada and with Mexico, I think they are able to say to the Europeans, this is very serious. You have to spend more money. And if you don't spend more money, we're going to leave. And as we leave, we may do things like try to take Greenland on our way out, try to get you to sell us Greenland, try to create a problem for you that necessitates that you sell it, generate economic trouble until you need the money such that you sell it, generate security problems so that you realize that you need things from us and are more willing to give them to us, right? Now, when he announced the tariffs, he announced tariffs on Canada, he announced tariffs on Mexico, the third state was China. The 10% tariff on Chinese exports dramatically increases the rate at which the United States is able to do decoupling. Now, decoupling doesn't mean that you get rid of trade between the United States and China. What it means is that you disincentivize further expansion of that trade, and therefore, in relative terms, you encourage more trade to happen with other states, not China, like the Philippines or Vietnam or India or Peru. Latin American states can benefit too, right? And in incentivizing this, you're not going to collapse the trade volume overnight. Year to year, if you look at the total goods imports from China, it's still going to be very sizable for a long time. But that number won't go up. And if the US economy grows at 2 or 3% each year, in relative terms, that number is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and less important. And when you fast forward 20 or 30 years from now, all of a sudden that number will not be the kind of impediment to a hard conflict that it currently is. And this is, if you think about when they use the word decoupling, they are literally talking about what happens with a train, right? If a train is pulling a car and you decouple the car from the train while the train is moving, for a while, the car stays with the train because the train was pulling it at the same speed that the train was going. It takes a while for the car to slow down after the decoupling has occurred and for a gap to open up. And that's their objective. The major consequence of that 10% tariff that it is concerning for me is that it will significantly accelerate that process. It will make it possible for a real conflict. I'm not going to say World War III. I would say something like a limited war over the status of Taiwan or over some of those islands in the South China Sea or over the status of a city-state like Singapore. Something like that could happen maybe 10 years sooner than it would otherwise happen. Maybe in something like 2040 rather than 2050 as a consequence of that. And there's no discussion really given to the 10% tariffs on China, in part because he did the tariffs on Canada and Mexico at the same time. What's going on right now is that some kind of deal is potentially being negotiated, and we'll see if they're able ultimately to come to terms. I don't think that he needs the terms to concede altogether very much. What he needs is a demonstration from the Europeans that the Europeans are going to step it up with the spending. And this is what really, really sucks for Canada, because Canada's a pawn in a negotiation with the Europeans about NATO. And his interest in Canada is primarily about setting an example for the Europeans, I think. Now, people take it further than this and suggest that he'd like Canada to become a state or become a group of states. I'm sure if Canada wanted to do that and Canada was willing to do it, he would be very happy to be the person responsible for that. But getting Canada to do that seems like a very tall order. I don't see Canadians looking to do that. I don't think there's any groundswell of support for that. So I don't think that's going to happen. However, using that kind of language produces this kind of madman Richard Nixon, scary person energy. And I do think that that has a certain usefulness. People feel like they don't know what's coming from him. They don't know what's next. There's too many things happening. They can't track them all. And this is something that's not just bothering ordinary people who watch the news. I go to academic conferences with people who study democratic theory. They can't keep up with it, and they're losing their minds over it. They're stressing out about it, and they're talking to each other and talking to each other into all kinds of wacky stuff over what's going on. You know, even the big adults in the room are having a very, very hard time keeping their heads on straight because it's so many things going on all at once. And especially, I think, if you're outside the United States, right now we're seeing certain things that usually happen quietly happening in a very visceral, out in front way. You know, every president for the last 2 or 3 administrations has begun the term, so Biden, first Trump administration, second Obama administration, with a bunch of executive orders. That happens all the time. But now it's being done on camera, and he's going, what's this one? What's that one? And he's making a big show out of it and drawing a bunch of attention to it. And so people are treating these things like they're really different. And, of course, every Republican administration going back to at least Bush begins with a tax cut. And then you have to try to convince people that this tax cut, which will mainly benefit the rich, will be good for them. And you have to do some kind of song and dance to convince them of this. And so now the song and dance is, look at the things we could cut that we think are useless. Don't you agree? Aren't they useless? What if we sent you a check for some money? Wouldn't you rather have that money than those federal employees in those jobs? That's the song and dance. It's a new version of the song and dance. It's more telegenic than usual, but the function of it is to create legitimation for a tax cut that will benefit principally the rich. Same as any Republican administration. So I see a lot of continuity there. I certainly think that the pivot to Asia is something that the Democrats are also interested in. A restructuring of the alliance system in Europe, in the Atlantic, is also very much something that the Democrats are interested in. And I would regard the Ukraine war as itself a tool and device in that, with some level of intentionality. Exactly how much they self-consciously use Ukraine to try to change the situation in NATO and make the European states behave differently, I couldn't say. I don't know what's in the minds of people, but certainly it has that function. The Ukraine war has definitely changed what's going on in Europe. It compelled Sweden to join NATO. Sweden, which wouldn't get involved in World War II, joined NATO. And I was recently in Sweden, and the Swedes are acting like the Russians are going to come and get them at any point, and therefore they need NATO. They have this consciousness of needing NATO that they've never had before. The Russian state has no capacity to invade Sweden or do anything serious to Sweden. Why would the Swedes think this way? Russia is at this point this huge gas station. The reason the Russians are so frustrated is that they've been denied the opportunity to grow since the end of the Cold War. They've been put at the back of the line because they have 150 million people. They can't join the European Union without a huge amount of population exchange. And every time the EU expands and Eastern European states are admitted, there's a bunch of migrants who come from Eastern Europe and the West, and it causes political problems. And they're able to keep those political problems manageable by only letting in so many Eastern European states at a time. Okay, Poland can come in this year, and then maybe Slovakia in a few more years, and then maybe Romania. That's how it works. But if you put a huge state in all at once, the number of people who are going to move for economic opportunity within the Schengen zone is going to be too high for them to absorb politically. We've seen how they struggle to absorb politically the population flow that's come out of the Middle East. That's driven by the foreign policy mistakes of the United States with regard to Iraq and with regard to the Arab Spring. They do not want 150 million Russians to have access to that zone. And that's why they've never allowed the Russians in. And the Russians are deeply frustrated because all of the states the Russians used to trade with keep getting admitted to this bloc that they never get admitted to. And Putin is completely sincere when he says he had wanted to join the bloc, tried many times to get in. Of course he did. Why would you want to be Belarus when you could be Poland? Who would want to be Belarus rather than Poland? Of course. But why would the Westerners let him in? They could barely let Poland in and absorb the political consequences of that. Before the migrant crisis with Middle Eastern and North African migrants, there was a major debate in Europe about Eastern European migration. And the liberals were barely able to keep a lid on it. So they're not going to just let Russia in. But if they're not going to let Russia in, what does this mean? Russia has to be a gas station for all eternity as its trading partners dwindle one after another? And it's down to this Eurasian Union, its alternative to the EU, which is a handful of states. And each of these states keeps defecting and jumping in as soon as they can. And now they're in a position of dependence on China, a state that they used to try to make their client state. Now it's reversed. It's a very stressful environment for them. And that's why they're trying to create an economic bloc. But states only look to create their own economic blocs in this kind of world that's dominated by this rich a central state if they are being denied decent terms. Russia and China have to make their own blocs because they're not getting decent terms. China wants to be an equal partner. It will not be treated as an equal partner. And indeed, because it wants to be an equal partner, it's in danger of being kicked out. So it has to construct around itself as many friendly states as it can so that it has a backup trade bloc in the event that it's ejected, right? Russia has even less capacity to build an independent trade bloc. If Russia gets kicked out, it's effectively compelled to join a Chinese-led trade bloc on terms determined by Beijing. Very frustrating. Understandably, if you were running Russia and this was your situation, you wouldn't like it either. But the thing that the people who sympathize with the genuine frustrations of the Russians keep doing wrong is then dramatically exaggerating the capacities of the Russian state. When they do that, they just feed into the narrative that Russia poses this threat to NATO, which requires all the European states to do whatever the Americans want to protect themselves. Bigging up the capacities of the Russian state doesn't help anybody. But people do this all the time. Anyway, I'm sure there's more you want to ask that's more specific and directed. But that's what I'll open.
Well, I had a list of topics, and you kind of just went over all of them. And I think it'll be helpful to dissect one at a time. Now, I wanted to do Canada first because, you know, Canadian citizen, got to put Canada first. But I think you just got off on a thought about Russia, Ukraine. We'll return to Canada. We'll return to Canada because I want to go Canada, Europe, China, and then the Ukraine war. But actually, let's just, since you just mentioned it, let's just pick at that for a moment because right now there's a kind of, as we're recording this, an ongoing spat between Zelensky and Donald Trump. So, like, Putin, like Trump, was treated as an irrational actor, and as a result, kind of depicted as like someone who's going to invade all of Europe. And Trump is also depicted as an irrational actor. As a result, it's kind of hard to understand what the strategy is, but you've kind of outlined a lot of things there. I just want to kind of highlight one very important thing you mentioned, which is this pivot to Asia. And by pivot to Asia, I think this is confusing for some people who are used to thinking in binary terms are used to thinking of like East versus West. But the pivot from Asia is like a decoupling from China because it's like the pivot to, Vietnam, India, and that's been going on for a while with like already Apple moved its factories to India. But Vietnam is an interesting one, right? Because like we used to thinking like, oh, this anti-West bloc. We kind of forget that Vietnam and China have kind of very ambivalent tensions, and Vietnam has, I mean, really historically played the U.S. and China off each other to try to benefit from both. And so, like, the thing about Russia, Ukraine, though, is something I overheard you saying in another podcast is why does the USA feel so comfortable being extremely aggressive with Russia in terms of like, getting as close as you can to full out war, basically, to direct involvement, getting as close as you really can at levels that would have been, you know, kind of unthinkable in the Soviet times. I mean, like in the Soviet Union US Cold War, like any kind of direct confrontation was seen as something that could lead to like, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Bay of Pigs situation and the Cuban Missile Crisis after scared so many people that like any kind of direct sort of like anything that would get too tense between the USSR and America would be treated as like World War III. And that's how people are kind of often talking about the Russia Ukraine stuff is like it could catalyze World War III. And you mentioned something in the pod where why does the US feel so comfortable this time kind of essentially bullying Russia? I mean, it's with a small percentage of its military budget has given so much to Ukraine for Ukraine to basically use US weapons to go strike Russia and straight up like take territory, do things that were, it's acts of war. And everyone's always saying, right? I always hear from like Jeffrey Sachs and uh, you know types who are more kind of like on the or John Mearsheimer even, right? Realists, they would always say that, "Oh, well, this is going to lead to World War III. Why are they doing this? This is irrational." But you made this great point, which is if it's so irrational, why do they keep doing it? Clearly, there must be something that, the call it the deep state, whatever, State Department of the United States knows that we don't know. I kind of want you to elaborate on that a little bit because to what extent is like, what is the rational kernel of the US's policy in Ukraine? Because I see also a kind of irrational element in the sense that doesn't like, wouldn't this push Russia and China closer to each other and like all these states that not all these states, but a lot of like states that were pitted against each other, which was good for US interests, right? China and US being pitted against each other. Is this not actually kind of bad for American interests? Or like what's going on here? Because like that aspect of the rational kernel of why they feel so comfortable. I feel like that is something I just did not hear from people who have observed this conflict.
Yeah, most people, when they talk about this stuff, they want to persuade the audience that they know things and they don't want to reference the things that they're not sure about or they don't know about. And so they project this excess of confidence. And then when they get stuff wrong, it really shakes the credibility. We live in a complicated world. And I think the benefit of a PhD, if you get one from anywhere decent, is an awareness of all the things that you don't know and all of the methodological difficulties that we have in answering any kind of complex question. I think one of the ways experts have tended to undermine their credibility with the public is to overstate what they know and to make sweeping claims that they really can't be sure about. So when it comes to something like Ukraine, it would have been unthinkable, as you said, in the Cold War to be doing anything like this. If you think about 1956 in Hungary, when the Soviets went in, there was really no serious consideration of any kind of NATO troops or NATO weapons going to the rebels in Hungary to try to enable them to defend themselves against the Soviet army. Anyone who talked about that would have been considered a total nutcase. Now, not only does that happen in Kiev, which is much further east, but they have been willing to move Ukrainian troops into the territory of the Russian Federation. They have been willing to strike targets inside the territory of the Russian Federation. We're not just talking about arming the Hungarians in 56. What if they had struck territory inside the territory of the Soviet Union, inside the Russian core territory in 1956? Myself, when this started, I thought that the Russians were going to roll over the Ukrainians. I thought there's no way the Ukrainians are well armed enough to hold off the Russians for any length of time. Many people had this view. The Biden administration was prepared to evacuate Zelenskyy. So it believed that there was a serious possibility that the war would go very much in Russia's favor very quickly, and that they would just have to get Zelenskyy out. The fact that that didn't happen was a huge surprise to a lot of people. And a lot of people don't acknowledge the degree to which it was a surprise and have kind of memory hold it because for them it was an embarrassing moment where they got something wrong rather than a learning moment. That was a learning moment. What does it teach us? Well, for one, probably there were more weapons going to Ukraine between 2014 and 2020 than many of us realized. Probably the Ukrainians were getting a lot more aid than we really realized they were getting. And also, it didn't cost that much because if it cost more, there would have been more of a footprint for it. This means that Ukrainian military can be armed in such a way that it's competitive with the Russian military. Not that it can dominate it or defeat it, but it can compete with it at a very, very cheap price. Now, you add to this their willingness to strike territory in the Federation. Why are they doing it? In the Cold War, we would have said, how can you possibly know that if you do that, they won't use nuclear weapons? How can you possibly know that you can do that without generating that kind of response? I think the Russian military and intelligence services are heavily exposed to the World Wide Web and to the American intelligence services through their use of the World Wide Web. I couldn't tell you specifically, technically, how they go about it, but that to me seems like the only compelling way of explaining, unless the Kremlin is just physically enormously bugged in ways we can't imagine. They must think they have very good information on the day-to-day conversation within the Kremlin, such that they can know Kremlin intentions to such a degree that they can conduct these kinds of operations. Otherwise, we would expect them to have stopped, or for people who are inside the State Department, inside the military, to be disobeying orders or leaking this out and going, oh my God, we're doing things that are incredibly risky. Do you guys know about this? There would be a ton of whistleblowers coming out about it and going, this is really risky. We're not seeing that. What we're seeing is old Cold War heads saying, if they'd done this in the Cold War, it would have been insane. And it would have been. But those guys are not getting briefed. Not anymore. If they used to get briefed, not now. Certainly not with the way they're talking on the internet. They're not going to get briefed. State Department and DOD are not going to brief people that they view as aiding the Russians. So they're not going to get this information if it's information that's available to be gotten by anybody. Now, of course, when you're speculating about information that you don't have, you have to be careful about it. I have no evidence. I can't offer any proof of this. I can't establish it. This is by definition a case where we don't have the information. What I can say is that The explanation I'm offering here seems more plausible to me than the explanation that the Biden administration is insane, especially given that this has been going on for so long. Why is it that if the Biden administration is being insane and miscalculating, it hasn't been punished with a nuclear strike? Why is it that the Russians have not retaliated in the ways that people are claiming are obviously the rational, reasonable ways for the Russians to respond that we should be anticipating? Clearly, the Russians are not thinking about those measures the way that the commentators who are expecting them to use those weapons are thinking about them. There could be all sorts of reasons for that. It's very hard to know exactly what the conversation is in the Kremlin unless you have very, very good wiretaps or credible cyber spying, which maybe they have. The thing about the intelligence services of the United States is that from inception, they were really designed and built to know what's going on in Russia. They were not designed and built to know what's going on in Iraq or in Vietnam. The one state that the United States has been committed to understanding for the purposes of competing with since the 50s, since the 40s even, is Russia. To the point where you can look at people who are retired now who went and studied Soviet studies in school and learned Russian for the purposes of gathering information about that state and how it works and how it thinks. So that operation has been in development for an incredibly long period of time. We can have all sorts of doubts about the quality of U.S. intelligence in areas of the world where these people don't operate as frequently, where conversations are conducted in languages or in cultural contexts they don't understand as well. This is the one situation where they have a ton of experience, and historically, it's tended to go better for them than they've expected. The fall of the Soviet Union pleasantly surprised them. That went better for them than they expected. From their point of view, that's not to argue normatively for their side of it, just to try to understand how do these people think and why are they acting the way they're acting?
I think there are two things that kind of add and perhaps reinforce that hypothesis. One of them is you're of course familiar with the term the Five Eyes, right?
Mm.
Like, which is the five countries that share intelligence services with each
Yeah.
other.
I've heard that too.
People kind of know, which is that the US, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, Australia all share intelligence with each other. Like their intelligence services cooperate highly in a way that the American and French intelligence services do not, and in the way that the American and Mexican intelligence services
The
do
new
not.
lingo for
Right?
this is
They have a
AUKUS, right? AUKUS is a formalized version of this,
Mhm.
a much tighter group of cooperators than the broader NATO alliance.
That's right. Very, very tight, kind of more transparent sharing of information in a way that this does not seem to exist with a lot of other states. And maybe that's not a it's not a coincidence why it is those countries who seem the most keen to be aggressive with Russia. Like the Canada has surprised me. I've tried for a while to make sense of Canada's position on Russia because Canada has been aggressively pro-Ukraine, very, very pro-Ukraine. And I thought at first the reason for this was that like the liberals just want to win over the huge Ukrainian diaspora because there is just a huge Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. We have the third largest Ukrainian population after Russia and Ukraine themselves. So there's a lot of votes there to be gotten. But I mean, like, why really, like, at the level of national security? I mean, do this because when you think about it in an immediate interest, Canada would be super vulnerable to attacks. I mean, like, just super geographically vulnerable to Russia in all sort of ways. And yes, of course, we have America behind us, yada yada. But like, still, it is pretty weird for a country like Canada to take a stance this strong when we've stayed out of American projects before, like American wars. Like, for example, Iraq. We've stayed out of Iraq.
Harper
In
was
Russia,
pro-Iraq.
he was pro-Iraq, but he wasn't the prime minister then. That was
Yeah,
John
but he
Chrétien.
came in
And John
and
Chrétien
did
famous.
contribute once he came in.
No, Canada did not involved in Iraq. They involved in
Yeah,
Afghanistan.
but he stepped
And
up the contribution. Harper was very keen to help Bush on all of that Middle Eastern stuff.
Right. Yeah, but Canada did not join the
Yeah,
actual
at the
Iraq
beginning.
War,
Yeah.
and yeah, well, because it was Harper didn't get it until I believe it was 2007 or
Yeah.
2006,
Yeah.
something along those lines. And the Iraq War was
Yeah, that's when it
2003.
started.
So yeah, so then Kretchen was president, famously did not. But they've been very keen on this Ukraine stuff. I mean, even the Canadian military, for as small as it is, there's actually a lot of strong, like, the Canadian military is good at very specialized things. Like we have a kind of special forces, and they train militaries abroad, and they've actually been training the Ukrainian military since 2014. In fact, that's something they've gotten a lot of flack for, is that they've even kind of helped the Azov battalion a little bit, like in terms of training. They're willing to train whoever in Ukraine is can pose a counterweight to Russia. So I thought, like, okay, why? In Britain, of course, is also very aggressively pro-Russia. I mean, they were the some of the people who were against striking a deal, right? Remember, there was almost that attempt to strike a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine that some of the people in the European Union wanted, like Macron, and the British were the most vehemently against it. I thought, why is Britain this island that could be nuked into oblivion, talking this big game with Russia? You know, they're talking so aggressively. They're talking about sending in troops, and I thought, like, you're England. This is stupid, but it may, like, perhaps they know something due to the American intelligence, due to their own intelligence, due to all their intelligences that we don't know. Now, there's also another thing that could add to your hypothesis, which is the incredible weakness of Russia. I mean, Russia is just not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a much stronger state militarily and ideologically. People don't realize how big a role that actually plays. Because one, I mean, Russia has a lot of nuclear warheads, but that doesn't mean it has a huge innovative military in the way that America does. Like, doesn't have the same level of technology, and it also doesn't have the nearly the same level of morale
We saw this with
that it
the
once
the
had under
tank
the Soviet Union.
strategy. Yeah, the sending in the tank columns thing that the Soviet bloc states did for decades. This hasn't worked very well since the 70s, but it was something that they still were inclined to do at the beginning of the war. Why do they do that?
Mhm.
They must not think that they have better stuff, or they think they don't need better stuff. Well, they definitely needed better stuff because they didn't achieve their objectives at the beginning.
And what's another factor is, like, I don't think it is a coincidence that, like, some the countries historically who seem to have the most notoriously powerful intelligence services have been countries with very high levels of nationalism or some level of, like, collective marginal, like, unity. Like Israel, for example. Israel has a very powerful intelligence service, and people who work for the Israeli state are committed to the Israeli project. Now, to, like, think about the project of being a spy, right? Like, being a double agent, that requires an incredible level of dedication to your country, like an incredible level. You have to really believe in that to, like, sacrifice your life like that, to live in such secrecy. And think about it, who are you more likely to be? When are you more likely to do such a job and do that job well and be loyal to it? Under the Soviet Union, when you have this kind of ostensible commitment to communism, which, people kind of gradually stopped believing in. But the evidence that I've looked at, it was actually kind of the people first who stopped believing it, and it was the leadership last who stopped believing in it, which is kind of fascinating to me about the Soviet Union. Is that, like, there was a kind of ideological aspect in the Soviet Union. A lot of people who, because they also got paid better. That was in many ways a kind of class division. People who worked in the kind of, like, intelligence services, high in the bureaucracy, they got paid pretty well, and they, were often very committed to this idea that we're this different vision. Whereas, what do you really have to be proud about in Russia today? Like, Russia has been a kind of decaying power. It really has, and, like, your Russian pride. Sure, but it's like everyone knows it's an oligarchy with a fake democracy. What does Russia really stand for? And Putin's tried to, rebrand Russia as this conservative, civilizational opposer to the Western, liberal, decadent, whatever. But, like, it seems very half baked, and it was seemed more of an election strategy since 2014 when he came back to power, 2012, forget what it was. But, like, what is if you're a spy in Russia today, what do you really have to be like? What incentives do you have to be super committed other than just being paid well? I see that like it wouldn't surprise me at all that if there's an incredible shortage of loyal spies in the Kremlin compared to the Soviet Union times, right? So like, it's probably not hard to get people to defect. It's probably not hard to get people to snitch. And also, you mentioned this factor, the web, like the fact that so much of the internet, so much of the social media is controlled by Western companies who, we've already seen collaborate with the intelligence services. So it's not a surprise actually that Russia's first instinct with the war was trying to decouple in terms of social media, and they've kind of haven't really fully done that. Like, but they try to ban Facebook, go to Telegram, but like encourage people to use Telegram more, right? But it's not like China. China has kind of already prevented this. China's has their own Facebook, it has their own YouTube, it has all that. Russia is still, I mean, YouTube is still exists in Russia. It's just kind of, you know, I forget, like, I think YouTube in many ways has punished Russians more than the other way around, actually, because they've tried to demonetize Russian creators for part of the sanction effort. But it is interesting, like, that must give an incredible power. Like, you have the internet, which can probably, like, through that all that data, you can track where people are, like how Israel tracked the Hamas leader through WhatsApp. And you have, like, a shortage of spies, and you have outdated technology. I mean, Russia's weak.
Yeah, and Hamas and Hezbollah, these are organizations that tried very hard for a long time to keep their people unknown to the Israeli state. That was something that was a high priority for those organizations, and they were still unable to do it. And those organizations were really committed quite seriously to what they were doing. And nonetheless, in part because they expanded, Hezbollah in particular, as it expanded, could not avoid bringing in Israeli spies who would pretend to be interested in joining Hezbollah and then use Hezbollah membership to get information that they could use to put these exploding pagers in people's hands. There is an incredible information apparatus that we only have little glimpses into here and there. It's been a long time since WikiLeaks. We haven't had a real update into how all that stuff works publicly in quite a while. And now there are these new Lord of the Rings companies, Palantir, Anduril. There's disruption going on in the defense sector out west. And Palantir is particularly focused on information gathering. And whenever you say the word Palantir, people go, ooh, Palantir. And the reason they're doing that is not because they know what Palantir is doing, it's because they don't know. It's because they're not sure what that name stands for, apart from an intention to see everything. Because that's what the Palantirs are in Lord of the Rings. They're seeing stones. Anduril, of course, is named after the sword of the king.
There's a book on the deep state by Mike. I forget his name, but he was a guy who actually worked in the Department of Defense, like way back in the day. Under like he was an older Republican who's kind of a defector of sorts. But he was a big thing he talks about is the relationship between Silicon Valley and the deep state, and like a big thing that is like crucial to U.S. hegemony is like technology, partially because it gives this incredible leverage over the whole world, being able to spy on people. And I wonder with like AI, because the AI race is very interesting to me because like with DeepSeek, what seemed to shock a lot of people is like not just that they made the Western companies have to charge less, right? I mean that's good for the consumer, but a thing that I saw like from like Republican politicians is this sort of almost projection, which is they would say, well, don't use DeepSeek. That's a way for China to spy on you. I'm thinking, well, why would I care about China's? I'm not like, I don't live in China. I'm not a Chinese citizen. What are they going to care about what I do? But it's like, it's a projection because that's what they do to everyone else and to their own citizens. So that is very interesting because it is scary. Like, I mean, I think the U.S. just does have the advantage technologically in the way that the way that China doesn't long term, and that technological power, like with AI, if people become dependent on it to compete in the world economy, and that there's this connection between Silicon Valley and the intelligence services, that is that doesn't look good for the people who are, the multipolarity end of U.S. hegemony folks. Like that does not look very good.
Well, and it's astounding to me that people think they can keep information away from these guys when they use phones or they have computers or they go online. You're not keeping information away from these guys. That's not happening. So, yeah, people who act like there's some easy and convenient way that you can organize against these people through the internet, yeah, come, whatever you do, it's got to be compatible with them seeing all of it. Whatever your strategy is, it has to be compatible with them seeing it coming. You're not going to be able to surprise these guys very easily. Yeah, it's really something that we can't theorize about very effectively because we don't know exactly what the capability is. And in that respect, if you're talking about left-wing organizing, it's not altogether different from, trying to do something as a foreign state. There's really an incredible black box that you have to deal with. You just don't know what's inside. And I think a lot of people, in part because they're not engaging in this kind of activity seriously, and they're really doing a kind of spectatorship where they cheer on other actors, that they're not actually taking any personal risk in trying to aid, like to talk down the capacities of the United States and to talk up the capacities of the rival factions because they have a rooting interest in the rivals. This is very different from actually trying to win and thinking about what winning would look like from the point of view of one of those rival states. Winning is not something that is really on the table. It's not something they talk about or think about. Their goal is not to beat the United States. Their goal is to find a modus vivendi, find a way that they can continue to do their thing as well as they can do it in a world where the United States exists. So the question then is there some kind of relationship you can have that's compatible with you continuing to do your thing? And the frustrating thing for the Russians is because of the size of their state, they're not able to get the Polish treatment. And yet, it's a major problem for them politically to not grow while the states that are their neighbors, that used to be in their bloc, used to be part of the Soviet Union, are growing. That's a major long-term source of instability. Your citizens will go, why can't you do for us what's being done for people in Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary? Why can't you do these things? And they have to come up with some sort of answer. And it's very challenging for them.
Now, before we move back to Canada, what confuses me is it seems now it makes more sense to me why the US and its, closest allies are so keen to be aggressive with Russia. But what I find interesting is that not too long ago, France was talking about being prepared to go to war with Russia even if the United States was to opt out of this conflict, which I find odd. I'm not really so much questioning the capabilities because if Ukraine can handle Russia, I think the French military could certainly handle Russia. But like, what is the point of Macron even talking about this? Like, what is Europe's interest to still be involved in this? Because Germany, of course, is the most like seemingly hurt by like this conflict in terms of like gas prices and stuff. So you have like it's why like a lot of the AFD, for example, is like kind of pro Russia in the sense that they want to warm up to Russia. I mean, what is France thinking here? Because France is always an oddball in geopolitics because they're kind of like part of the West, but they've always been semi-independent, like pretty independent, very independent actually, at the level of intelligence services, militarily, and kind of all that. So, like, what's their game plan here?
Yeah, they're less exposed because they've got nuclear energy. If you've got a different source of energy from Russian oil and gas or American liquefied natural gas, your level of direct energy stakes here is not quite the same. Most of these states in Europe started looking to fold up their nuclear plants after Fukushima. There were demands from the publics to improve safety by closing up nuclear plants. And France has generally resisted such demands to a much greater degree than other states in Europe. And this has given France a little bit more energy independence and therefore more ability to think about this separate and outside of the question of the consequences for the energy sector and then on downstream sectors. In the German case, it's very difficult because German industry needs a lot of energy to work, and there's still a lot of exports, industrial production and exports in Germany. So a high energy prices period is quite bad for Germany, particularly because Germany remains so opposed to any kind of devaluation of the euro that would help the exports make up for the fact that the energy prices have gone up. So Germany's in a quite nasty spot. But for the French, I think the nuclear power is a significant part of the story. And then also, one of the goals of Macron is to stop this Le Pen problem that he's been dealing with, which is a kind of anti-European Union, anti-Europeanism force. The Ukraine war can potentially generate a level of unity in Europe by unifying Europe against the external Russian entity. And therefore, there is some level of attraction for some European leaders to that conflict on that ground alone. Now, that's not going to be enough for states that are badly exposed. And it's certainly not going to be a factor for someone like Boris Johnson, who has no stake in constructing a European identity because he's leading a state which has withdrawn from the European Union. But for a state like France, which has got nuclear power, for whom the major threat in the next 10, 15 years is perceived to be the right within France, that's something that they certainly can entertain.
But I mean, why care about Ukraine though? Why does France care about like pushing off Russia? Is it just political to unify EU, or is it like also like is there something about Russia that they feel threatens them aside from Russia backing right-wing candidates? Because it seemed to me more that Russia was backing right-wing candidates as a way to like as a response to like Europe siding with Ukraine, like as a way that was their way of screwing with
And
them by
the
like
right wing
backing all these
candidates have
far right candidates.
also themselves been more likely to support the Russians or to oppose the Ukraine war. So by framing
Mhm.
these right wingers as not patriotic because they are backing a foreign state, there's a way of trying to undercut their messaging. That would be the strategy that I think they're deploying. They're going, well, you're so pro France, but then why are you all of a sudden pro Russia? Maybe we're actually the ones who are pro France. And so there's
Mm,
jockeying going on.
I see.
Gaullism is something that is open to everyone. Yeah. Because in
Right.
French political history, there is no single politics that is straightforwardly associated with France. There's multiple kinds of monarchism and 5 different types of republics that have existed. So what it means to be French is very much up for grabs in a way that it's not
Mhm.
in other places. And it can be contested through this language of republicanism and through many of other languages that you can use to try to get control over what it means. So Macron in particular is quite adept at taking populism and reorienting it and deploying it in different ways on his own behalf, which is sometimes why he's framed as a radical centrist rather than just a centrist.
He's trying to be like De Gaulle, but doesn't quite have the same level of charisma. But because De Gaulle would sometimes flirt with left-wing ideas. People forget that. Like De Gaulle would sometimes say like capitalism is good for creating wealth, but it harms the poor, and we need to always protect the poor, and we can't have too much capitalism like in America.
Yeah, more of
It's
a
like you
post-war kind of
be like
liberalism there in De Gaulle. Whereas when we're
yeah.
talking about Macron, it's an attempt to do a lot of reforms that would make the French economy more like the German, while at the same time emphasizing a French
Mm.
distinctiveness, which diminishes the degree to which this copying of the Germans humiliates the French.
Yeah, right. Because that's all the austerity
And the labor
they're trying to
market
do.
reforms, those old Hartz reforms in Germany, so many states think they have to do that. They have to have flexible or competitive labor markets, by which they mean much easier to fire people to be able to exist in an economic bloc with Germany and be
Hmm.
competitive and pull your weight. And the attitude in France is as long as France is not economically competitive, it cannot be politically competitive. It has to be Germany's equal economically to be able to have the muscle. And it has not been willing to follow some of the other strategies people have cooked up, like the idea of a romance league.
So you said that Trump's strategy with Canada is really to use Canada as a sort of example for Europe because like that's who they really care about. They want Europe to, you know, they also want to think, maybe make them think like, what if you didn't have our support? What if like we were hostile to you? This is what could happen, and it's easy to do that with Canada, because Canada, despite all our talk, unfortunately, Canada can. I mean, they can cut off energy, but like, what is that going to really do long term?
Because of the fracking
Right.
was a success. The fracking that everybody opposed during the Obama administration, it actually worked. It generated an enormous amount of new oil and gas domestic in the United States to the point where the United States can export oil and gas to its allies. So the way of thinking about the United States in relation to oil and gas that dominated in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s was shattered and destroyed by what the Obama administration did. It's now a totally different environment for energy in the United States, which is part of why the United States cares so little now about climate change, so much less than it did
Yes.
before, even. People think of the United States as not having cared in the 2000s. It emphatically and dramatically cares much less now.
Nixon seemed to care more than we do
Yes,
now.
yes. And this is because once you're a petrol state that stands to gain from that, it does change the way in which people view it. And now it's a stick. Now it's something you can use. The Europeans can be made dependent upon American oil
Hmm.
exports. Imagine telling somebody in 2005 that that's what was going to happen in 20 years, that the Europeans would be dependent on liquefied natural gas loaded onto ships. Loaded onto ships. You know how inefficient compared to pumping it in from Russia that is? How much more expensive that stuff is? And it's harder to get out of the ground. It's more expensive to drill it too.
Right.
It's a
It's true about Canadian oil as well. Like
Yeah, it's shale oil.
when people like, yeah, people in Canada are always like, oh well, especially the conservative types. They're like, well, we have oil here. Why don't we just like, why don't we just export more and more oil? But it's like we're not Saudi Arabia. Like the way in which Canada exporting oil just has way more consequences than it does for Saudi Arabia. It's just much harder to dig it out of the ground, and with way more catastrophic consequences. I mean, it really destroys the whole area, like environmentally that happens in. I mean, it destroys the drinking
Yeah.
water of like a lot of those areas,
Oh,
right?
yeah. And yet these areas are so economically deprived in many cases by industrialization over the last 50 years, they don't care. People who live in these areas vote enthusiastically for the drilling because they see no economic alternative. Nobody's doing any other kind of development or offering them any other kind of path apart from telling them to move somewhere that it's too expensive for them to live in anyway. So I think that
Well, not all the indigenous communities, like in Canada, Alberta, BC, indigenous communities kind of more hostile. None of it's a little different. None of it is like an oddball, because
Yeah.
sometimes people like none of it's one of those places that is so depressing to live that you can actually make so much money working in natural resources and none of it. But like yet so few people go, so that's why the wages are so high, because they just desperately want people to work there. Because like it's a thing that people do if they don't want to go to college, they'll go to none of it for a few years. And it's like, yeah, I'm gonna make money and come back and I can afford so much stuff, and they're like they just have depression and they're spending all their money on booze after. It's, it's
The same
dark.
thing happened in
It's
the
dark. Like I mean,
Dakotas in the States when the fracking kicked off there. Lots of people had that experience, took that journey, and it didn't go the way they hoped it would go.
if you want to understand why Jordan Peterson is so erratic, I mean, it's because he's from Alberta. Like that's why he's the way he is. It's depressing in those crazy winters. I mean, in Ontario here, it's already pretty bad. I can't even imagine, further up north. But so like, okay, if this is to bullying Canada as a way to show an example to Europe, how is this long term good for American interests by getting Europe to be more economically independent, because that could potentially have the consequence of them pivoting to China, right? Some
Militarily
people have
independent,
speculated
not economically
military.
independent.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah. Sorry,
trick.
I meant right. Militarily, like basically, they don't want to pay so much for European military spending, and that the America does the majority of the majority of NATO military spending. Why, though? Like, wouldn't this also have the consequence potentially of like EU states pivoting more to China? like in terms of being like, okay, well, we'll show you Americans, we're going to collaborate with your enemy. And I mean, China has no shortage of things to
It
sell.
has no
I mean,
energy
it's
to sell.
often
That's the thing. It doesn't have any
right.
energy to sell. What the Europeans need is energy. They don't need the things China's good at making, consumer goods. They have plenty of consumer goods. Their problem is that they don't have energy, especially a state like Germany, which manufactures stuff. It needs energy so the car factories can run, so those cars come out at a cheap enough price so that they can compete with the cars made by all of these non-union labor factories all over the world. So it's not just a question of do you have, can you trade? Do you have stuff to sell? Do you have what people in this particular part of the world need and want to buy? So part of the trouble is
Mhm.
that the destruction of the pipeline and the conflict with Russia has created an energy dependence vector with the United States. Also, the European economies have grown much less at a much slower rate since 2008 than the American economy, which means it's a smaller sector with less leverage in international trade negotiations. So the kinds of deals Europe can get on its own with other states are not as good as the deals that might have been available 10 years ago when the Europeans were hemming and hawing about Obama's free trade agreement and going, we don't like these terms. Well, as a result, that agreement has been canned and it's not coming back. So, of course, if the Americans were concerned about the Europeans becoming more economically independent, they could offer free trade terms along something like the lines Barack Obama originally proposed. But there doesn't seem to be a need for that because the European economies have not grown quickly enough. They don't have a sufficient level of energy independence. They don't have the physical capacity to spend. Their currency is not able to back itself up without assistance from the Americans. And this was discovered in the euro crisis to the great shock of the Europeans that the euro was dependent ultimately on support from the US dollar and therefore on the Federal Reserve. The euro has not proven to be the source of stability that the Europeans thought it would be. It has not given them the level of autonomy or independence that they would like to have. So there is, I think, a lot of reason to think that the Europeans,
You mean Europe as a whole or European states?
Europe
Because I
as
mean,
a whole.
obviously, because European states, I mean, it's obviously
Oh, of
really bad
course, yes.
for
But the amazing thing is that
yeah.
Europe as a whole has less monetary autonomy than it would have liked to have. That even though you can trade a euro for a dollar for roughly equivalent value, that masks an actual serious difference between the two currencies and the way in which they're treated by international markets, especially given the disruption and trouble that was had about these bonds that were in euros during that period. Where all of a sudden you think you're buying euro bonds, but you're actually buying bonds that are tied to many different states, which may or may not be following the rules. And there's questions about the rule following and the level of economic coordination. It's not as tight as you might have liked to think. All of these things gave the bond markets a lot more of a spook about buying European bonds in general, holding euros in general. Compared to dollars, the euro is not trusted as much. It's only trusted insofar as the dollar backs it up. When the dollar backs it up, there's still a significant level of trust. But if there were ever any real doubt about the dollar backing up the euro, if the European Union was really genuinely antagonistic to the United States, not in an alliance structure with the United States, how stable would the euro be? This is a major question. The answer to it's not obvious. You can make arguments that the euro might be able to shake out, but it's not clear that it would. It would raise a lot of alarms. And just the mere presence of these alarms would drive up the costs of things in the event that you tried to do this separation. It would create uncertainty in the markets that would be responded to with a lot of angst and unease. So the Europeans are less economically autonomous than before. The pivot is not about giving Europe more economic autonomy. It's about getting Europe to spend more on defense. And when Europe is spending more on defense, it's investing less in its own future economic development. It's investing less in its public services. So by making Europe spend more on defense, Europe's economies are further appendage to the United States, and the Europeans become even less economically autonomous, which then furthers the security dependence. what is happening, and this has been going on since World War II, is that Europe is being turned into a plush Delian league, right? If you think back to the Athenians and their League of Cities, that were all brought into the Delian League ostensibly to fight the Persians, but then to fight the Spartans, which wasn't why they came together. And then if any of them tried to break out or leave or do anything else, there were triremes that were going to be rowed at them with great speed and much force. Yeah. A similar kind of thing is going on here, where these European states are not being welcomed into the United States as states. They're not being given senators or representation or rights vis-a-vis the American political system. But they are also being made increasingly dependent on American decisions.
Yeah, so I'm not yeah. So I'm not 100% sure about the whole Euro argument you're making. I would have to give it some more thought before I can give a proper response to that, and maybe come back to that later. Just because I see kind of the decline of the euro more as just a reflection of the decline of the European economy, and usually like the currency value is more of an effect than a cause. In that, like the euro has been going down relative to the US dollar, also due to the fact that, like, by just so many metrics, the economy in Europe has been worse since 2008 and especially since COVID compared to the United States. It's another kind of fact that problematizes the whole decline of US hegemony narrative.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm
Um,
talking specifically about the euro crisis, not the value of the euro, right? Specifically, how the euro
uh-huh.
crisis was managed as a monetary problem. They ended up
Okay,
turning to the
right.
Americans, which was so embarrassing. They thought that the euro meant that they didn't have to do that. That's part of the shock of the euro crisis.
And did they have to do that? That's a kind of question. It's like, did they really have to do that actually? Um,
There's things they
but
could have done with the support of the Americans, and the Americans were willing to support them in doing things that they were not themselves willing to do. Specifically, the Germans, the IMF, and the Americans would have backed them in doing various things that Merkel specifically was not willing to do, and Schauble, the finance minister.
hmm. Okay, so I think I want to bring it back to Canada now because, yeah, like I've said in the introduction, I've never seen so much unity in Canada than I've had in a while. Like, it's really weird that Trump's tariffs have somehow single-handedly revitalized the Liberal Party. And I kind of hate to see that because, as soon as like Trudeau said he was going to step down, and now there's a battle for who's going to success him, but it's not who's going to succeed him, but it's not really a battle. Everyone knows it's going to be Mark Carney. Mark Carney was finance minister. He was also not finance. He was Bank of Canada, and he also worked for the Bank of England before. He's kind of a globalist technocrat of sorts, but he's a very centrist, kind of like neutral, non-antagonizing middle-aged white guy, which, there's incredible strength to that. Like, really, like, if you get someone who doesn't have too much cringe behind them and too many gaffes, and you just don't make people hate you, you can really make people like you. It's weird how him being kind of the front runner and Trump's tariffs and the response that he has had has actually, like, if you look at the polls on the Liberal Party are now in a competitive position with the Conservatives. I thought before this happened, the Conservatives were going to get a super majority. It was going to be a complete wipeout. I still think the Conservatives will win, but if they win, they'll probably be a minority. At least if things stay the way they are. It's changed so much. But like liberals have just in the polls gone up. And what's weird is despite like this kind of Canadian pride, the NDP have stayed the same. They haven't gone up. It's the liberals who have gone up. The NDP have stayed in the same stagnant position as they were before, which does problematize, by the way, people who say, "Oh, it's just the liberals and not the left." The problem is liberals and leftists are not liberals. Why are you attacking liberals? I always get that reaction from leftists whenever I'm critical of the left. But I mean, there you go. Look at that. Okay, you're the problem. Fix. But okay, the fact is historically nationalism in Canada has had a sort of progressive bent. It's been kind of come it's come from the left actually. And even when the conservatives champion nationalism, they would support a kind of like certain kind of like watered down socialism. I mean, people call it red Toryism, is terms people use for it. But like Canada has always positioned itself in opposition to America as the more egalitarian. We're not as, obsessive about greed as you guys are. And what's weird though is also how like there's all these, well, it's not weird. I don't know why I keep saying it's weird. It's just funny to see that there's all these election incentives for all the politicians across the board to just at the provincial level, right? To say that they're standing up for Trump. Immediately, Doug Ford, because there's an election coming up, conservative premier, he says we're going to cut off energy to the U.S. and talking like a big game. And the premier of Quebec also saying that but the Liberals were the first to do it. And I think because they did it more aggressively than even the Conservatives did it. The Conservatives have been doing it too, but people in Canada know, okay? The Conservatives, at least since the Brian Mulroney years, since the neoliberal turn, have been the more pro-US party, like in terms of US integration. So like what people don't really take Poilievre's promises to put Canada first that seriously in the way that they do with the Liberals. And regardless if this is a smart strategy of the Liberals, which I don't think it is, been a very effective electoral strategy in kind of saying we're standing up to Trump's tariffs. And Trump pauses tariffs, right? And he pauses tariffs on Mexico, and in exchange for these border concessions. And then Canadians thought they had a victory, but now Trump introduced new tariffs. So it's like, what's going to happen, right? I do wonder, like, what is Canada's way to kind of deal with this? Because I think we're in for some economic hardship, like some real economic hardship. And the reason we don't feel it right now already is largely because in Canada, the economic hardship has been primarily that cost of living for housing and cost of living via inflation, the grocery inflation. Whereas the first way we would get destroyed by the tariffs is primarily due to all the jobs being destroyed. Because like if the US places tariffs on our goods, that means like businesses in Canada will struggle tremendously, right? And that will have an effect more on like unemployment initially and on GDP than it will on inflation. So it's like in Canada, I don't think we're quite processing how negative this is going to be. And this could have an even more negative effect if we start tariffing US goods, right? And then which could cause inflation in our area. So it's like, I mean, I guess Canada could like subsidize domestic industries like it does with the dairy, but there's risks in that too. But like it is like what are we actually supposed to do? Because like it seems like the thing is to stand up to Donald Trump, the bully, right? But like I mean, the facts are just like Canada. Most of the stuff we sell is to America, and we have built a dependence on the U.S. ever since the mid 1960s. Well, actually, really since Lester B. Pearson. This is kind of the famous Pearson versus Diefenbaker debate, because Diefenbaker is the last red Tory prime minister, and he was all anti-U.S. integration, well, not anti-U.S., but kind of wanted more independence. He was very nationalist. Pearson's the kind of more globalist, and that's how it's framed anyway. But it's true, it has truth in it. We've built a dependence for a while, okay? So like what does Canada actually do? Because they talk about standing up to Trump. What does that even look like? And how could that even work out well for Canada? If like what is the best case scenario and the worst case scenario for us?
Yeah, so I want to distinguish here between the very newest tariffs, which are on aluminum and steel. They're in specific sectors, and the tariffs that were proposed and then withdrawn, which were total economy tariffs, world-ending nuclear tariffs that would have completely destroyed the Canadian economy. Those would have applied to absolutely everything. And since exports from Canada to the United States are a quite sizable percentage of Canadian GDP, we're talking 20-25%, I think, that would not have worked. Canada could not have borne that for any length of time, which is why there was this discussion about should Canada attempt to do some spending to counter the effects of the tariffs? And if so, when should that spending happen? At what point do you fire the gun? Because you don't have unlimited ammunition when you're in a high inflation environment. I think that it had a lot to do with finishing off Trudeau. Just the possibility of this and the fact that there isn't a really good strategy for dealing with it. And in particular, Trudeau initially proposed doing the spending rather early and in a relatively uncoordinated way. And I think that this did kick up a certain level of frustration within the Liberal Party of, this seems like it's not taking it sufficiently seriously. It doesn't seem like a sufficient response. And it's maybe pulling the trigger too early before we really know precisely what the form of the tariffs will be. Shouldn't we try to hold our our cannon until the last possible moment when we can really see what we're dealing with and fire it then? Was the argument, as I understood it. Of course, you're in Canada, so you might have more detail or a little bit of a clearer picture of it. That's what I picked up on. Does that sound about right?
It's not why finance. Those are all factors, yes, because I mean, people saw it as Trudeau trying to win the election by doing some last minute spending, but which all so many of Canadian politicians do. Our premier just gave us everyone a $200 check right before the election. It's like, so it's just literal patronage.
Or a $5,000
But
check right before you do a tax cut for rich people.
right. With Trudeau, it was the finance minister, Christina Freeland, stepped down more because she was demoted prior to that. So she was demoted from her position. And she saw that as a huge act of disrespect on Trudeau, who she was loyal to this whole time, the entire crisis, throughout all his unpopularity. And she's also like a huge part of why he has like a lot of support that he does. I mean, she has connections to the Ukrainian community. She's very big with the feminist types, right? Who Trudeau has like on lock. Now, she saw it as like, you're going to demote me? Because, of course, Trudeau wants to distance himself from the perceived failures of the Canadian inflation by kind of, shifting people around in his cabinet. She saw that as disrespect. So she was like, okay, you're going to bring me down. I'm going to bring you down with me. That's how like most of the Canadian media seem to see it.
Okay.
So
So it
I
wasn't
think that makes
just
a
the
lot of
tariffs.
sense.
It was her attempt to use the tariffs as a stick with which to beat him because he had already moved against her over the previous entanglements that they'd been in over the years.
The additional spending. So the additional spending that he proposed, which she rejected, is the kind of stick that she's like using as an excuse as to, this is just not responsible, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah.
Which is
Right.
connected to the
But
tariffs
it's
because her
more political.
argument that it was irresponsible had a lot to do with needing this money when the tariffs come. At least that's what I saw quoted in the press.
I'm not sure about that. But well, if it is, I think they're wrong about that. But that's because it depends. Like for money, what do you mean? Depends what you're
Well,
spending
they were
on. Like there's
quoting
some things
her
that are
saying
inflationary and
that
some that are not.
whether it
Right.
is or isn't an effective
Yeah.
argument. They said that
Sure.
she said that.
Right. Well, yeah, the excuse she gave, right, was this irresponsible spending. So, that you're correct. But like the more thing that people speculate as to why the real reason is political in the sense that like, she's just pissed off, frankly. She got demoted. And it's why the NDP also supports Trudeau throughout all this crisis. People they'll say it's because the conservatives will win if we have an election. We can't have the conservatives because they're like so much worse than the liberals, which is not really true. They're
Did the
not that
NDP
much
threaten
different.
to force an election if Trudeau didn't quit? Wasn't there a letter that they put out?
Yeah,
Okay.
it was a empty kind of threat. It was a threat that like, I really think if Trudeau didn't step down, like the governor general might have even gotten involved. And if she wouldn't, it would be such a sign of her bias because like if this was like, I mean, this is Canada's crisis now is worse than like the Labour Party's crisis in Australia when the governor general got involved and like called an election, dissolved parliament. This was like, I think it was in the
Yeah,
late
oh, yeah.
70s or something.
Oh, that's a
Again,
great story.
era.
The left should know that story
Yeah.
better. It really is a wonderful case of seeing this kind of system pushed to its absolute limit in an Anglophone context. That's one. If you ever do a 30-minute long video about something from history, that would be a great one to do. Have you done it yet?
No, that would be interesting. It's just that whenever I might do a podcast on it, we'll see. Because I mean, it is interesting. I mean, the governor general can do that, of course, and this is something I think people don't realize about Canada is like limits on democracy. But anyways, the reason why they didn't actually prior, because before all the parties wanted Trudeau to basically call an election, and they wanted a vote of no confidence. It was NDP preventing the vote of no confidence. And why does Jagmeet Singh not, who's a leader of the NDP, not go for that? I mean, the theory that the Conservatives have been posing, which I did not quite buy till now, I totally buy it, which is the idea that he is basically trying to protect his pension, because in Canada, if you're a member of parliament for a certain amount of time, like I believe it's 10 years, you get a much greater guaranteed pension. Like you just get like a lot of
Oh,
money.
wow.
And if there was an election, Jagmeet Singh might be in risk of losing his seat. Like he might be at risk of losing his seat. So like he would be literally 1 year short, or like less than that, of getting his pension. So, there's a real financial interest of him there to like prolong this election as much as is possible. And I don't know, some people on the left think that like their guys are totally immune to total selfish power ambitions, and it's like I don't see that at all. I think like a lot of these guys are just as. I think Jagmeet Singh's a huge opportunist. I mean, the fact the guy lost 3 elections in a row, worse each time more than the last. I mean, and he still didn't step down, shows a huge level of like narcissism, I think, on his part. But the with regard to with regard to Canada, we're in kind of a financial situation that looks so bad to the point where I've noticed with the Conservative Party that even Pierre Poilievre seems almost reluctant to win. And this is kind of more speculative claim, because before he was going hard against Trudeau. Like I've never seen a politician, frankly, I'll make the bold statement. Pierre Poilievre has ran the most effective, aggressive campaign. Well, we'll see, I guess, long term if it's truly effective. But he's run one of the most impressive campaigns I've ever seen a Conservative politician run in Canada, ever. Maybe a Canadian politician ever. Just at the level of social media, the aggressive media, targeting certain audiences. He would know how to target the younger men crowd, the older middle-aged women crowd. He would target the minority crowd. He would know in a way that like just it seemed like this guy was dedicated to win at all costs. He was playing dirty also with the prime minister in a way that you just don't see in Canadian discourse. Like he was really he was just nasty in his depictions. Now he's kind of quieted down a bit. He seems almost reluctant and almost afraid to get in there with Trump. You know, it's really interesting because I think he knows that if the Conservatives are elected, which they probably will be, probably by us, not a huge margin, it's not much. They're going to be like inheriting a terrible situation. Like they're just bound to disappoint. It's why I actually hope they win. In fact, the Conservatives are going to win now. It's better they win now than or else the country will move further and further and further and further to the right, because it's like, they know there's not much they can do. They're never about but I do wonder, there's a few things, and this is more where the question part is, could the silver lining in this be that this pushes Canada to finally actually maybe have a long-term strategy for more independence? Because there's been people in the back who've been yelling for a long time, Canada needs its own military capacity. It also needs, more economic independence. But also, the military thing, that's a position like leftists have and some people on the hard right do. Canada should have more economic independence. And I think now it might actually kind of in the long term push Canada into that, like quietly, at least in the long term. And I think maybe that's, if there is a silver lining,
There's
to
not
that.
enough capacity. There's just the Canadian economy is not big enough to compete with the United States or to support a military
No,
that would be
I'm not saying.
competitive. So what it does is it
I'm
attracts
not saying.
negative
No, no,
attention and escalates it. What the Canadians need to
I'm
do
not
is
saying
to
it's all.
avoid the attention of the United States. The winning strategy for
Yeah, I'm not
Canada,
saying to compete with the United
yeah,
States. I
to
just want
try
to
to be
clarify.
independent
Yeah,
from
I'm
the
not
United
saying.
States, militarily or economically.
No, I'm not even saying. I'm not even saying into fully independent. The whole Canada is destined geographically to be in an alliance
Yeah,
with the U.S. This is just. There's no possible way it can
right.
change that. What I'm more suggesting is that at least as a bargaining chip, when the U.S. says, because when the U.S. says right now that Canada does not spend at all on the military, Jesus Christ, I cannot talk today. It spends among the least on the military than like all of the
Yeah,
NATO
and
countries,
this is
really.
part of what makes it
And
such
that's
a good
absurd
target for
because they can
this.
stand,
Yeah.
at least as a bargaining chip, if it had some degree of economic dependence and military dependence, it could at least bargain with the US at more favorable terms than it can now. So there's all kind of reasons for this. So I think maybe it could push that.
Oh, yeah, it could definitely cause Canada
You
to
know,
spend more on the military within the current alliance structure, to go to 2%. Yeah, that could happen.
I wouldn't underestimate our capacity either, because there's a few things that Canada has. It has one of the US's biggest strengths, immigration. So, like, the Lee Kuan Yew quote, which is China has something billion people, America can draw on the population pool of the whole world. Well, outside of America, the country where people tend to want to migrate is Canada. Canada has it can do immigration in a way that Europe simply cannot. Like, it's gotten much worse at this, I think, with multiculturalism because, like, before Canada would it be more melting pot. It would be like you blend in by Canada by being part of our values. It's not about your race, it's part of your values. But the pivot to multiculturalism has been more about, okay, well, you can have your religion, you can have this, and it's different cultures. There is a
So
real
more
shift in the
European
ideology of
style.
multi which is it's very actually different from the older Canadian strategy and very different from the strategy that's still kind of the case in America, which I think is more effective for immigration, which is the more blending strategy. But Canada has the capacity, at least because it's an Anglo country with a culture that's very easy to assimilate to, unlike Europe. There's just so much room for bringing in talent. We have quite good universities. In fact, we bring in tons of talent that we don't use. You have tons of people who go to our colleges and pay huge prices, and then they go back because there's no jobs in Canada. And I've met so many people. It's incredible who will be like studying aerospace engineering, astrophysics, you know, just like very skilled technical jobs, and then they don't have anything to go into. They'll just say they want to go into finance because in Canada, one of our biggest sectors is still actually banking. And I'm thinking like, there's just so much. We have so much talent here that we're totally wasting. There's tons of productive capacity we actually do have and could have long term. Now, there's also this is more accelerationist and depressing because I would want climate change to accelerate. But the fact is the way things are going, it is accelerating. And Canada just has a whole parts of Canada that weren't habitable are going to become habitable. In fact, this is kind of, the conservatives quietly. It's why they kind of are pro ramping up oil production because they see this as an economic benefit. That it's similar to the Russia case. Actually, you'll have a lot of places that were uninhabitable now become economic
Yeah.
zones that people actually want to
What's the
go
deal
to.
with the Canadian Shield? I've heard arguments to the effect that the Canadian Shield makes it difficult to settle some of the territory further north. Is that just about being cold, or is it also about the terrain?
It's a lot to do with the terrain. It's also, it's an exponential sort of thing. Like when you don't have people want to go live in an area and there's less consumers in the area, businesses don't want to invest in the area, and then because there's less people to, buy their services. And when you have less people invest, there's less money comes. It's a kind of, it's why it's like a uneven development problem, the classic uneven development
Yeah,
problem.
it's the thing that has always struck me as strange about Canada is that there's so much space, and yet so much of the population lives so close to the U.S. border. It's what, 90% of the population living within 100 miles of the border? A
Yep.
lot of really underutilized land.
A lot. There's a lot of potential in Canada. I mean, the biggest thing is the skilled labor force. We don't realize that Canada has incredible levels of like skilled labor and it has like one of the most renowned education systems. We have a lot of barriers to that. It's complicated. We actually could have a way better healthcare system. It's largely due to our laws that make it very difficult for people who have doctor certification to become doctors and nurses actually also in Canada, even if they had training in, let's say, India or Iraq or Lebanon, which actually do have much better medical systems than we might think. And a large part of this is not to do with like, oh, are they going to be good enough? It has to do with the nurse union.
Mm.
It is a big tragedy in Canada that like some of the only unions we have left are actually some of the most like counterproductive ones. Like the nurse union has been a huge obstacle in Canada to like, laws that would allow for more nurses. That would basically allow for more immigrants to become nurses easily because it would mean lower wages.
And that's tended to be a knock on the Canadian healthcare system, that problem leading to
Yeah, it slowed down the Canadian healthcare system a lot. There's a lot of things that slowed it down, partially due to it being provincially administered is a big factor because, you have it's tax funded. It's tax funded by the provinces, not by the federal government, which is, that itself is a huge limiting factor. But the biggest thing is also the physical productive capacity. We have a nurse shortage. And like every time we try to, pass laws to like have more nurses, the nurse union, causes a problem. And it doesn't help also that the Conservative Party are so committed to austerity and they want the public healthcare system to get worse so that they can give more excuses to privatize it.
and affordable housing. That's been the problem in Canada for a long time. To really get the numbers up, the population count up, there would have to be an explosion of affordable housing, probably out on the Canadian
Well,
Shield.
we've had actually a huge migration surge, and the issue is we haven't had the public housing to accommodate that, and that's why another reason why like actually it's not actually the main reason why the housing bubble overall, but it's the reason why it's gotten particularly worse in Vancouver and Toronto.
Yeah, and the Canadian federal
my-
government doesn't have the same physical capacity relative to the provinces, in part because the provinces are economically stronger relative to the federal state. Like, in terms of how much the Canadian provinces' budgets are, it's much more competitive with the federal budget, as I understand it, than, say, individual U.S. states' budgets are with the American federal budget. The American federal government has much more physical capacity.
I wouldn't put it in terms of capacity. It's more that responsibility. So in the sense that the provinces have way more economic independence from the federal government than states do in America. And that's in large feature a policy choice. That's mostly a policy choice. Actually, a very recent one. One of the 21st century, actually, kind of it was the 90s and 2000s really, where they started to shift housing away mainly housing away to the provinces and to the cities. Actually, cities are in charge of like a big percentage of public housing, and they're
It's the
like the most in it.
devolution.
Yeah, but like in terms of capacity, I mean, in terms of monetary capacity, Canada has quite strong monetary capacity because all our debt is in our own currency, and we have our own currency. All our debts in our currency, and we're also, we don't use foreign currency to spend for any of our public spending. Like it's not like Venezuela. It's not even like Mexico. Mexico still has like bonds in USD that it depends on, so that it can buy stuff with U.S. currency. Canada has more monetary sovereignty than even Mexico does, and you've seen Mexico make pretty big leaps in terms of independence in the last 10 years. So I think there's a lot Canada can do actually. But we have these structural problems, and we also do have
You
ideological
also got to
problems.
get
We
out
have
of the high
austerity
inflation environment that we've been in since the pandemic, that has made it much harder for states to spend without generating inflation than they could have done in the 10s. A lot of states missed the window. Mexico took advantage of a window in which there was a lot of support for spending available. And that window after the pandemic very much tightened up. And now it's a much more difficult environment. The arguments that people are making in the 10s for spending don't translate quite as well now because of that change in the environment.
So I guess this brings us to the MMT discussion, which we can have in the back room since that was the most Patreon requested topic. Like I had a patron specifically say, "Yo, I love Ben Studes, man, but you got to talk to him about MMT." Anyway, excited to go into this discussion more about MMT, but also a little bit about some other things. If you're not part of the backroom already, you're very much missing out. And it's the price of a Starbucks latte for a whole month, and you get over 50 exclusive podcasts. Stop buying overpriced coffee and become a patron of One Dime Radio, and you get all these great conversations we've been having. And you also get to support this project because it's literally the only way it survives.
Yeah, Tony makes these fantastic videos in addition to the podcast, and supporting him makes all of that possible.
Appreciate it.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra